There are places in human history where power and goodness seem to align perfectly, where prosperity and virtue walk hand in hand through the same gates. The land of Uz was such a place, and in its eastern reaches lived a man who embodied this alignment so completely that his name became synonymous with integrity itself: Job. Consider for a moment what it means to be called the greatest man in all the East. Not the wealthiest, though he was that. Not simply the most powerful, though power followed him like a shadow. The greatest. This singular title carried weight beyond measure, representing something far more valuable than gold or land. It represented an architecture of influence built on foundations that seemed unshakable. 7,000 sheep moved across Job's pastures like living clouds. If you had stood on the hills overlooking his lands, you would have seen them spreading across the grasslands, their wool catching the morning light, each one representing not merely wealth, but capacity. Sheep meant wool for trade, meat for feasting, sacrifices for worship. They were living currency, reproducing themselves, their value compounding with each season. In the ancient world, such a flock represented liquid power assets that could be moved, sold, or transformed according to need. 3,000 camels stood in his caravans. Now, camels were different. These weren't pastoral creatures grazing peacefully in familiar fields. Camels meant something else entirely. They meant reach. They were the vehicles of long-distance trade, capable of crossing deserts that would kill a man on foot, carrying goods to distant markets where margins grew wide and opportunities multiplied. Each camel represented connection to far-flung trading networks, to exotic goods, to knowledge of distant lands. They were power that moved, influence that travelled. 500 yoke of oxen worked his fields. Imagine 1,000 of these massive beasts, muscles rippling beneath their hides, pulling ploughs through soil, turning earth into productivity. This was agricultural power at a scale that fed not just a household, but entire communities. Oxen meant food security, surplus production, the ability to weather drought or disaster. They represented the foundation layer of ancient wealth, the capacity to extract sustenance from the earth itself. 500 female donkeys completed the inventory. Donkeys, the workhorses of the ancient world, moving goods locally, carrying loads, enabling the daily commerce that kept an estate functioning. Breeding donkeys at that, each one capable of producing more donkeys, their numbers growing like compound interest in flesh and blood. But livestock alone doesn't make a man the greatest in the East. Job's household was large, very large. The text doesn't specify the exact number of servants, but the word used suggests something more than simple domestic help. These were managers, herders, traders, craftsmen, guards, a complex organization of human labor and loyalty. Each servant represented not just labor but relationship, obligation, trust. In managing such an organization, Job didn't simply command, he had to inspire, to organize, to adjudicate, to lead. His household was a society in miniature, and he stood at its center. What made Job truly remarkable, though, wasn't the accumulation of these assets. Accumulation alone creates merchants, not moral exemplars. No, what set Job apart was the integration of his wealth with something rarer, an unassailable reputation for righteousness. The text tells us he was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. These weren't empty platitudes. In the honor-shame culture of the ancient Near East, reputation functioned as a kind of social capital, as tangible in its effects as silver or land. A reputation for integrity opened doors that wealth alone could not. It created trust, and trust enabled transactions that would never happen between suspicious parties. It generated goodwill, and goodwill translated into allies, information, opportunities. Job's moral standing was a strategic asset, perhaps his most valuable one, because it made everything else work smoothly. His religious practices reveal the careful mind behind the prosperous exterior. Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters, a complete family in ancient reckoning, symmetrical and blessed. These children didn't merely exist as heirs. Job had structured their lives to serve multiple purposes. His sons held a cycle of feasts, rotating houses, each brother hosting in turn. This wasn't mere celebration. Think about what this accomplished. It kept the siblings bonded to each other rather than competing. It displayed the family's prosperity to the community. It created regular occasions for family cohesion that would prevent the fragmentation that often tears wealthy families apart. And Job performed a ritual that reveals something profound about his character. After each cycle, for a feasting, he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings for each of his children. His reasoning was striking. Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Perhaps. Not certainly. Perhaps. Here was a man who anticipated problems that hadn't yet materialized. He thought ahead, imagined potential failures, and took preventive action. This was defensive strategy at its most fundamental, identifying vulnerabilities before they could be exploited, shoring up weaknesses before they became crises. His children might not have sinned at all, but Job wasn't taking chances. The sacrifices served as insurance, as spiritual maintenance, as paternal vigilance expressed through religious ritual. This pattern of thought, this anticipatory problem-solving, ran through everything Job did. His integrity wasn't passive goodness, the kind that simply avoids evil through inaction. It was active, constructed, maintained. He had built righteousness into the operating system of his life, made it habitual, systematic. When the text says he did this regularly, it means Job had turned moral excellence into a discipline, a practice as routine as morning prayers or evening accounts. Stand back and observe what Job had accomplished. He controlled massive economic resources across multiple domains: pastoral, agricultural, commercial. He commanded a large and presumably loyal organization of people. He had created family structures that prevented internal conflict while projecting external prosperity. He maintained religious practices that connected him to the divine while demonstrating his piety to the community, and through it all, he had cultivated a reputation so spotless that no one could question his character. This was power with depth. Most powerful men inspire fear or envy. Job inspired something more complex: respect, tinged with awe. He had achieved what most never attempt: the synthesis of prosperity and virtue, the alignment of self-interest with righteousness. His success validated him, and his character validated his success. The system reinforced itself at every point. In the ancient world, where life was precarious and fortune uncertain, Job had created something that seemed permanent. His wealth was diversified across multiple asset classes. His family was structured for continuity. His reputation provided social insurance. His religious devotion connected him to divine favor. Every angle was covered, every vulnerability addressed. He had, in a sense, optimized existence. The text calls him the greatest man among all the people of the East, and now we can understand what that meant. It wasn't hyperbole, it was observation. Job had mastered the art of living well in every dimension simultaneously: material, social, familial, spiritual. He was wealthy but not corrupt, powerful but not tyrannical, pious but not fanatical, successful but not isolated. He had threaded every needle, balanced every tension, achieved every goal. If there was a formula for security in the ancient world, Job had solved it. If there was a way to build a life that seemed proof against disaster, he had found it. His position appeared unassailable, not through force, but through the comprehensive excellence of his character and the depth of his resources. Imagine being Job on any given morning. You wake in your substantial house, surrounded by family. Your servants begin their work, maintaining the complex machinery of your estate. Reports come in from the fields. The flocks are healthy, the herds are growing, the crops look promising. Your children are feasting together, maintaining their bonds. Your reputation in the community stands unquestioned. Your conscience is clear because you have, once again, performed the rituals that maintain right relationship with God. Everything works. Everything coheres. The architecture of your life stands solid and beautiful. This was not luck. This was construction careful, deliberate, sustained. Job had built this edifice of prosperity and righteousness stone by stone, decision by decision, day by day. He had played by the rules, every rule, and the system had rewarded him exactly as the wisdom traditions promised it would. Righteousness led to blessing. Diligence led to prosperity. Integrity generated trust. Piety secured divine favor. The equations all balanced. The promises all held. For a man like Job, the universe must have seemed fundamentally ordered, fundamentally just. Good behavior produced good outcomes. Moral excellence generated material success. The cosmos was rational, predictable, manageable. If you did the right things, in the right ways, with the right attitude, reality would cooperate. The architecture of righteousness created an architecture of security. But there is something you should know about architecture, about any structure built by human hands or human virtue. The taller it stands, the more magnificent it appears, the more it attracts attention. Not all attention is friendly. Not all observers wish the structure well. And sometimes the very perfection of construction becomes a kind of challenge, a question hanging in the air. In the heavenly realms, beyond Job's knowledge or concern, beyond the careful calculations of his righteous life, a conversation was about to begin. A question was about to be asked, and that question would test whether the architecture Job had built stood on foundations deeper than strategy, whether his righteousness ran deeper than advantage, whether his faith was more than a very sophisticated form of self-interest. The greatest man in all the East stood at the summit of his achievement, his life a testament to what human virtue and divine blessing could accomplish together. Everything he had built was about to be tested, and the test would reveal truths about the nature of faith, the meaning of righteousness, and the relationship between heaven and earth that would echo through millennia. But for now, on this particular morning, the sun rises over the land of Uz. The sheep graze, the camels stand ready, the oxen work the fields. The children feast, Job performs his rituals, and everything for this brief and final moment is exactly as it should be. Perfect, complete, secure, or so it seems. There are moments in cosmic history when the machinery of the universe pauses, when powers beyond human comprehension gather to consider questions that will reshape individual lives. One such moment occurred in the heavenly realms, in a council where the divine held court and celestial beings presented themselves before God. Among those who came was one called the Satan, not yet the embodied evil of later tradition, but something more subtle, an adversary, a tester, a prosecuting attorney in the court of heaven. He had been roaming throughout the earth, walking back and forth on it, observing, always observing, and God asked him a question that would change everything. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Consider this for a moment. The Almighty, pointing to Job as an example, the greatest man in the East now becomes the subject of divine pride, a specimen of what human righteousness can achieve. But the Satan had indeed considered Job. He had watched the architecture we described, seen the careful construction, noted every element of Job's prosperous life, and he had reached a conclusion. Does Job fear God for nothing? 5 words, a simple question, but contained within it is a challenge that strikes at the very heart of faith, relationship, and motivation. The Satan wasn't denying Job's righteousness. The evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, he was questioning its nature. Was Job's piety genuine devotion or sophisticated calculation? Was his fear of God authentic reverence or strategic positioning? Did Job love God, or did Job love what God provided? The argument is elegant in its simplicity. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Satan had identified what he believed to be a transactional relationship: righteousness in, blessing out. Devotion offered, prosperity received. From this perspective, Job's faith was no different than a business arrangement services rendered in exchange for compensation. Remove the compensation, the Satan argued, and the services would cease. Take away the blessing, and the devotion would vanish like morning mist. This is a devastating hypothesis, because it suggests that all human virtue might be ultimately self-serving, that even the greatest righteousness is merely enlightened self-interest, that faith itself is a form of cosmic barter. If true, it means that disinterested goodness, love, without hope of reward doesn't exist. It means that the universe contains no genuine devotion, only well-disguised exchanges. God accepted the challenge, but with limits. Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. The boundaries were set. The test would be confined to Job's external possessions, his wealth, his household, his children. The man himself would remain physically untouched. These parameters defined the experiment. Could Job's faith survive the loss of every material blessing while his body remained intact? The Satan withdrew. The test began. What happened next demonstrates something chilling about strategic efficiency, about how precisely disaster can be targeted when there is intelligence behind the destruction. Job's world didn't erode gradually. It didn't decline through natural processes. It was dismantled systematically, simultaneously, with surgical precision. Job was likely going about his daily business, perhaps reviewing accounts, perhaps making decisions about crops or herds when the first messenger arrived. Breathless, terrified. The Sabaeans raiders from the south had attacked. They had fallen on the oxen and donkeys while they were ploughing and grazing. 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, all taken, and the servants tending them put to the sword. Only this one messenger had escaped to bring the news. Think about what this meant. In moments, Job's agricultural capacity was eliminated. The beasts that worked his fields, that produced his food supply, that represented the foundation of his economic pyramid gone. The people who managed them dead. Years of accumulated assets vanished in a morning raid, but there was no time to process this information. While the first messenger was still speaking, a second arrived. Fire, fire from God, the messenger said, had fallen from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants. 7,000 sheep, the vast flocks that had covered the hills like clouds, the wool producers, the sacrifice suppliers, the living wealth that reproduced itself consumed, the shepherds who tended them incinerated. The language is telling, fire of God. In the ancient world, lightning strikes, spontaneous combustion, the kind of fire that seems to come from heaven itself. What matters is not the mechanism, but the interpretation. This wasn't natural disaster. This wasn't human agency. This appeared to be divine judgment, heaven itself turning against Job. The second messenger was still delivering his devastating news when a third appeared. The Chaldeans, organized raiders from the north, had formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on the camels. 3,000 camels, every single one taken. The servants who guarded them killed. Only this messenger survived. Now Job's commercial reach was severed. The animals that connected him to distant markets, that made long-distance trade possible, that extended his influence beyond local boundaries, stolen. His connection to the wider economic world cut. In 3 strokes, his entire economic infrastructure had been destroyed. Agricultural production eliminated. Pastoral wealth consumed. Commercial capacity stolen. But the Satan's strategy hadn't reached its peak. There was one more target, one more attack that would cut deeper than all the economic losses combined. The 4th messenger arrived while the 3rd was still speaking. This is important, the timing. Each messenger appeared before the previous one finished, creating a cascade of catastrophe with no pause for breath, no moment to absorb or respond. The psychological effect was calculated. Overwhelm, disorient, crush. And this final messenger brought news that transcended economics. Job's children, all of them, had been feasting in their oldest brother's house. Remember this detail from the first chapter? The rotating feast, the family bonding strategy, the structure Job had created to keep his children unified. That very gathering had become the mechanism of their destruction. A mighty wind, the text says it came from across the desert, struck the house. The building collapsed. All 7 sons, all 3 daughters, dead. Pause here. Consider what this represents. Job's economic power could be rebuilt given time. Livestock can be replaced eventually. Trading relationships can be re-established. But children, there is no replacing them. These weren't generic heirs. They were specific human beings, individuals Job had known since their birth, raised, sacrificed for, worried about, loved. His biological legacy gone. His future dynasty ended. The next generation that would carry his name and continue his line, extinguished in one catastrophic moment. The strategic brilliance of the Satan's attack becomes clear when we map it out. He didn't just remove wealth, he removed the foundations of wealth, the capacity to generate new wealth. He didn't just take assets, he took productivity. And then, having stripped away the material base, he struck at the emotional core, the relationships that gave meaning to the wealth. The 4 messengers, arriving in waves, each one interrupting the previous one's report, created a symphony of disaster. There was no time to grieve one loss before the next arrived. No space to process. No opportunity to respond. Just wave after wave of devastating news, each one building on the last, until the accumulated weight of loss became nearly incomprehensible. Job's response has echoed through the centuries. He stood up. He tore his robe, the traditional gesture of grief in ancient culture. He shaved his head, another mourning ritual, and then he fell to the ground. But what came next was not what the Satan had predicted, not what any cynical observer would expect. He worshipped. Naked, I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Listen to what Job did here. He reframed everything. The wealth he had accumulated, the children he had loved, all of it, was understood not as earned possession, but as temporary gift. He entered the world with nothing. He would leave with nothing. Everything in between was borrowed, entrusted, provisional. The Lord gave, this acknowledges source. The Lord has taken away, this acknowledges sovereignty. May the name of the Lord be praised, this maintains posture of worship regardless of circumstances. This wasn't denial. Job had torn his robe, shaved his head. He was grieving genuinely. He felt the losses. The pain was real. But beneath the pain, deeper than the grief, there was a foundation that the losses hadn't touched. His faith wasn't contingent on the blessings. His worship wasn't payment for prosperity. There was something in Job's relationship with God that operated independently of reward or punishment, gift or loss. The text adds a crucial line. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. This is what the Satan had predicted. This is what the entire test was designed to reveal. Would Job curse God? Would he charge the divine with injustice? Would the loss of blessing produce abandonment of faith? No. The Satan's hypothesis was wrong. Job's righteousness wasn't strategic. His faith wasn't transactional. Remove the hedge of protection, strip away the blessing, take everything he valued, and the man still worshipped. The architecture of his external life had collapsed, but the foundation beneath it held. This is remarkable. Think about what Job had lost in a single day. His economic empire destroyed, his children dead, his servants killed, his future eliminated. Everything that had made him the greatest man in the East gone. If faith is indeed a transaction, this is where it should have broken. If devotion is truly conditional on blessing, this is where the condition should have triggered. The contract should have been nullified. The relationship should have ended. But it didn't. Job's response reveals something profound about the nature of genuine faith. It isn't contingent. It isn't conditional. It doesn't operate according to contract law, where one party's failure releases the other from obligation. Instead, it recognizes a relationship that transcends circumstances, a loyalty that operates beyond calculation, a trust that doesn't require understanding. In the heavenly council, the Satan had raised a question about motivation, about whether true devotion could exist. Job's response provided an answer, not in argument or theology, but in action. Stripped of everything that made life prosperous, comfortable, successful, he maintained his posture toward God. The hedge was removed, the blessing was taken, and the man still praised. This is the kind of discovery that changes everything. It reveals possibilities about human nature that cynicism cannot accommodate. It demonstrates that people can love beyond self-interest, trust beyond reason, maintain faith beyond proof. The Satan's hypothesis that all virtue is ultimately selfish was confronted with empirical evidence to the contrary. But here's what makes this story continue. What prevents it from ending here with Job vindicated and the test concluded? The Satan wasn't finished. His hypothesis had been refined, not abandoned. If economic loss doesn't break faith, perhaps there's another way to test the question. Perhaps there's a deeper level of self-interest that hasn't yet been touched. The cosmic council would meet again. Another question would be asked, and Job's test would escalate to a new and terrible level, moving from his possessions to his person, from what he owned to who he was. The Satan had lost the first round, but he believed he understood what had gone wrong. He had struck at Job's wealth and his children, but he hadn't struck at the man himself. That, the Satan believed, would make all the difference. The greatest man in the East sat in the ruins of his former life, his body intact but his world destroyed. He had passed the first test magnificently, maintaining faith when every reason for faith seemed to have vanished. But the architecture of his righteousness was about to face a different kind of stress, a different kind of targeting. And the question that haunted heaven, does anyone fear God for nothing, was about to be asked again, in sharper form, with higher stakes. The cosmic wager continued. The test was not yet complete. The heavenly council convened again. The sons of God presented themselves before the Lord, and among them came the Satan, returning from his wanderings across the earth. The previous test had yielded unexpected results, and now the conversation would resume with new parameters, new arguments, a refined hypothesis. God spoke first, and there's something significant in this. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. Notice what's being acknowledged here. Job had been ruined. The word is stark, unambiguous. His life had been dismantled without cause, without justification based on his behavior. The test itself was the reason, the cosmic question. And through it all, Job had maintained his integrity. The divine pride in Job had been vindicated. The Satan's hypothesis about transactional faith had been proven wrong. But the Satan wasn't ready to concede. He had a response, a new argument, a different angle of attack. And what he said next reveals a deeper understanding of human motivation, a more sophisticated theory about what people truly value. Skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. Skin for skin. It's an idiom, a proverb, and like most proverbs, it compresses wisdom into memorable form. The meaning: a person will sacrifice anything external to preserve what's internal, will trade any possession to protect the body itself. You can take a man's wealth, his children, his status. These are external, separate, outside the boundary of self. But the body? That's different. That's the self in its most immediate form, the vessel of consciousness, the instrument of experience. Touch that, and you touch something that cannot be replaced, cannot be rebuilt, cannot be mourned and moved past. The Satan's new hypothesis was elegant. Job had maintained faith despite catastrophic loss because, ultimately, he still had himself. His mind still worked, his body still functioned. He could grieve, yes, but he could also feel, think, act, potentially rebuild. The core remained intact, but remove that. Integrity attack the body itself, and self-preservation instincts would override any spiritual commitment. The will to live, to avoid suffering, to escape pain, these would prove stronger than faith. It's a more sophisticated argument than the first. It recognizes that Job's response to loss was genuine, that something deeper than simple transaction motivated his devotion. But it proposes that there's a final level of self-interest, biological survival, freedom from suffering, the basic animal drive to avoid pain and preserve function. This, the Satan argued, would be the breaking point. God granted permission, but again with limits. Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. The boundary was crucial. The Satan could attack Job's body, could inflict suffering, could undermine health and comfort, but could not kill him. Job would endure whatever came. He couldn't escape through death. The test required him to remain conscious, aware, experiencing. What happened next was methodical in its cruelty. The Satan afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. The description is comprehensive, no part of his body was spared. These weren't mere blemishes. The Hebrew suggests boils that burned and oozed, that itched and tormented without ceasing, that made every movement agony and rest impossible. Imagine this transformation. The greatest man in the East, whose body had presumably been healthy, strong, capable, now covered in suppurating wounds, every nerve ending screaming. Sleep becoming impossible because there was no position that didn't press sores against surface. The simplest acts, walking, sitting, lying down, transformed into exercises in pain management. The body that had been taken for granted, that had simply functioned as the reliable vehicle of will and intention, now became a prison of suffering. But the physical suffering was only one dimension. In ancient Near Eastern culture, skin, diseases carried profound social implications. They rendered a person ritually unclean, unsuitable for temple worship, dangerous to be near. The concern wasn't just medical, it was spiritual, social, existential. A person with visible sores became an outcast, excluded from community life, avoided by the healthy, regarded with a mixture of pity and fear. Job moved to the ash heap, the garbage dump outside the city, where refuse was burned, where the marginalized gathered, where social death became literal location. This wasn't just about finding a place to sit, it was about accepting exclusion, acknowledging that he no longer belonged among the living community. The ash heap was liminal space, neither fully in the city nor completely outside it, a zone for those who occupied the boundary between life and death, belonging and exile. He took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it. The gesture serves multiple purposes. Practically, it provided some small relief from the itching. Those scraping inflamed sores likely brought as much pain as relief. Symbolically, it was a mourning gesture, a physical expression of grief and degradation. The greatest man in the East, reduced to sitting in ashes, scraping his diseased flesh with garbage. And then Job's wife spoke. Her words have been debated for millennia, sometimes portrayed as temptation, sometimes as desperate pragmatism. Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Before we judge her too harshly, consider what she had experienced. She had lost the same children Job lost: 7 sons, 3 daughters, dead in one catastrophic moment. She had watched the economic empire collapse, seen servants killed, witnessed the destruction of everything their family had built. And now her husband, the last remaining person from her former life, sat in ashes, covered in sores, suffering visibly, endlessly. Her argument had logic. If integrity yields only suffering, what purpose does it serve? If faithfulness to God produces this outcome, what value does faithfulness have? You've maintained your righteousness, she observed, and look where it's brought you. Release yourself. Curse God, acknowledge the injustice. Rebel against the source of suffering and die. Let death end what life has made unbearable. It was an off-ramp, a way out, a logical conclusion to an illogical situation. If the relationship between righteousness and blessing has broken down, if the cosmic order has proven itself unjust, then abandon the pretense, speak the truth of that injustice, and accept the consequences. Death would be consequence and release simultaneously. Job's response was sharp. You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? There's frustration in his words. Calling her foolish was harsh. But beneath the frustration lies a consistent theology, a framework he had articulated earlier and maintained now. God gives, God takes away. The relationship isn't contingent on continuous blessing. To accept prosperity as gift from God, but reject suffering as incompatible with God, is to misunderstand the nature of divine sovereignty. If God is truly sovereign, then all circumstances, pleasant and unpleasant, fall under that sovereignty. This wasn't emotionless acceptance. Job was suffering. The text makes that clear. But his suffering didn't trigger abandonment. He rejected the logic that said pain justified rebellion, that agony entitled him to accusation. The foundation that had held when his possessions were stripped away held again when his body was attacked. The text adds, in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Notice the precision. It doesn't say Job didn't suffer, didn't question, didn't struggle. It says he didn't sin. His words remained within bounds, even under extreme duress. The Satan's second hypothesis that attacking the body would break faith was proving as wrong as the first. But Job's test was about to enter a new phase, one that would challenge him in ways neither the loss of possessions nor the assault on his body had done. 3 friends were about to arrive, men who knew Job's reputation, who had heard of his catastrophe, who came with intentions of comfort. Their names were Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. When they first saw Job from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. The man who had been the greatest in the East, whose appearance had presumably reflected his status and health, was now unrecognizable. The transformation was so complete, so devastating, that they began to weep aloud. They tore their robes the same gesture Job had made and sprinkled dust on their heads, traditional mourning rituals, and then they did something remarkable. They sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. 7 days, 7 nights, in silence. This was strategic wisdom. They recognized that Job's suffering exceeded verbal response, that anything they might say would be inadequate to the magnitude of loss and pain before them. So they chose presence over speech, solidarity over advice. They sat with him in the ash heap, sharing the location of his degradation, witnessing his suffering without attempting to fix or explain it. But silence, especially extended silence, creates space for thought. And thought, especially in the presence of suffering that seems to defy explanation, generates theories. The 3 friends were observing, assessing, trying to make sense of what they saw. Job's catastrophe challenged their understanding of how the world worked, how divine justice operated, what righteousness meant in relation to prosperity. Ancient wisdom traditions taught clear equations. Righteousness produces blessing, wickedness produces curse. The righteous prosper, the wicked suffer. This wasn't just theory, it was the foundational righteousness, the assumption of moral order, the framework that made sense of fortune and disaster. But here was Job, the most righteous man any of them knew, suffering catastrophically. The equation didn't balance. The theory didn't fit the evidence. During those 7 days of silence, the friends were formulating responses to this theological crisis. They were preparing arguments, gathering evidence from tradition and experience, constructing frameworks that would restore coherence to a situation that seemed to challenge everything they believed about divine justice and human morality. They couldn't accept that righteous suffering simply happens without cause. That possibility was too destabilizing, too threatening to the moral order they understood. So they developed an alternative explanation, one that would preserve their theology while accounting for Job's suffering. If the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer, and Job is suffering catastrophically, then perhaps Job isn't as righteous as he appears. Perhaps there's hidden sin, secret wickedness, unconfessed guilt that explains this outcome. The 7 days of silence were ending. The friends had their theories. They were preparing to speak, and when they did, the battlefield would shift from external disaster to intellectual combat, from physical suffering to theological warfare. Job would face a new kind of attack, one that targeted not his possessions or his body, but his self-understanding, his claim to innocence, his conviction that he had done nothing to deserve this suffering. The Satan had attacked Job's wealth. Job worshipped anyway. The Satan had attacked Job's body. Job maintained integrity anyway. Now, without the Satan's direct involvement, Job's friends were about to attack something deeper, his certainty about his own righteousness, his claim to innocent suffering, his right to maintain that he didn't deserve this fate. The ash heap remained, the sores remained, the pain remained. But now, voices would join, the suffering, arguments would compound the agony, and Job would have to defend himself not just against loss and pain, but against the accusation that he had brought it all upon himself through hidden sin. The cosmic question continued to hang over everything. Does anyone fear God for nothing? Job had proven the Satan wrong twice, but the test wasn't finished. The most difficult trials don't always come from obvious enemies. Sometimes they come from well-meaning friends who cannot accept that innocent suffering exists, who must find explanations that preserve their worldview, even if those explanations destroy the sufferer's last shred of dignity. The silence broke, and with it, a new phase of Job's ordeal began. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes not from circumstance but from those who try to explain your circumstance. Job was about to discover this. He had endured the loss of wealth, the death of his children, the affliction of his body. He had maintained his true integrity through all of it. But now came a trial of a different nature, the trial of having his suffering interpreted, analyzed, and ultimately blamed on him by those who claimed to be his friends. Job's opening words shattered the 7 days of silence. What emerged was not calm acceptance but raw anguish, not patient endurance but desperate longing for non-existence. May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, "A boy is conceived." That day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. Listen to the strategy here. Job wasn't cursing God, he was cursing his own existence. If he couldn't die now, he wished he had never been born. If he couldn't end his suffering, he wished to retroactively erase it by erasing himself. It's a kind of temporal escape, if present relief is impossible. Perhaps past prevention might have been possible. He went further, weaving a dark poetry of non-existence. Why did I not perish at birth and die? As I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest. Job was describing death as liberation, as the great equalizer. In death, he said, kings and counselors rest together. The small and the great are there, and the slave is freed from his owner. Death becomes attractive not as darkness, but as rest, not as ending, but as peace. The logic is devastating. Existence has become so burdensome that non-existence appears preferable. This outpouring of grief, this wish for obliteration, opened the verbal battlefield. The friends had listened for 7 days. Now they would respond, and their response would reveal something troubling about human nature. Our tendency to defend our understanding of how the world works, even when defending that understanding requires attacking those who suffer. Eliphaz the Temanite spoke first. As the eldest, perhaps, or most respected, he took the role of initial responder. His approach was sophisticated, beginning with apparent sympathy before moving to subtle accusation. If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? Think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. But now trouble comes to you, and you are discouraged. It strikes you, and you are dismayed. See the rhetorical strategy. Eliphaz began by acknowledging Job's past role as comforter and teacher. Job had helped others. Job had been strong. This creates a framework. You were wise when others suffered. So why aren't you applying that wisdom now? It's a gentle rebuke disguised as encouragement, essentially saying, practice what you preached. Then Eliphaz moved to his central argument. Should not your piety be your confidence and your blameless ways your hope? Consider now, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plough evil and those who sow trouble reap it. Here is the theology, stated clearly. Innocent people don't suffer catastrophically. The upright aren't destroyed. Evil brings consequences, not righteousness. The implication is unavoidable. Job, you are suffering catastrophically. Therefore, you cannot be innocent. Your destruction proves you weren't truly upright. Something in your life hidden, perhaps, secret, maybe brought this upon you. Eliphaz claimed divine authority for his position. He described a vision, a nighttime revelation. A word was secretly brought to me, my ears caught a whisper of it. Amid disquieting dreams in the night, when deep sleep falls on people, fear and trembling seized me and made all my bones shake. A spirit passed before his face, and a voice asked, "Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can anyone be more pure than their Maker? If God places no trust in his servants, if he charges his angels with error, how much more those who live in houses of clay?" This is brilliant rhetorical positioning. Eliphaz wasn't just offering opinion, he was claiming revelation, divine communication, supernatural authority. And the content of that revelation established a framework. Humans are inherently flawed. Even angels make errors. Therefore, Job's protestation of innocence must be misguided. No human can claim true righteousness before God. Your suffering, Job, is simply the inevitable consequence of human imperfection. The strategy was to make Job accept the explanatory framework that suffering indicates sin, that his afflictions prove guilt, that the proper response is confession and repentance. Eliphaz ended with what sounded like encouragement. "Blessed is the one whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal." This is suffering reframed as education, pain as reframed pedagogy. Accept it, Eliphaz suggested, and restoration will follow. Resist it, maintain your claims of innocence, and you're simply prolonging the necessary lesson. Job's response revealed that he understood exactly what Eliphaz was doing. He wasn't comforted, he was cornered. If only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. No wonder my words have been impetuous. Job was saying, "You have no idea of the magnitude of my suffering. You sit there comfortable, offering explanations, but you haven't experienced what I'm experiencing. My words seem reckless to you because you're measuring them against normal suffering, but this isn't normal suffering." Then Job did something crucial. He refused the theological framework. What strength do I have that I should still hope? What prospects that I should be patient? Do I have the strength of stone? Is my flesh bronze? Do I have any power to help myself now that success has been driven from me? He was making a different argument entirely. I'm not resisting divine discipline. I'm simply acknowledging that I'm breaking under impossible weight. You want me to be patient, to hope, to accept this as correction, but I'm human, not stone, not bronze. There's a limit to what flesh can endure. And then Job made a devastating accusation against his friends. Anyone who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. But my brothers are as undependable as intermittent streams, as the streams that overflow when darkened by thawing ice and swollen with melting snow, but that stop flowing in the dry season, and in the heat vanish from their channels. Think about this metaphor. A stream in flood season appears strong, reliable, abundant, but let the dry season come, the real test of need, and the stream disappears. Job was saying, "You were my friends when I was prosperous, but now that I truly need support, you offer accusations, disguised as wisdom. You're unreliable exactly when reliability matters most." The battle lines were drawn. Eliphaz had established the friend's position. Suffering indicates hidden sin. Job must confess and repent. Restoration follows admission of guilt. Job had rejected this framework. "My suffering exceeds my transgression. You mistake the magnitude of my affliction. Your comfort is actually accusation." Bildad the Shuhite spoke next. His approach was different from Eliphaz's mystical visions. Bildad appealed to tradition, to the accumulated wisdom of the ancients. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. This is remarkable for its bluntness. Bildad suggested that Job's children died because they sinned. Their deaths weren't tragic accidents, but divine judgment. This cuts deep. Job has lost his children, and now he's told they deserved it. Bildad continued, "But if you will seek God earnestly and plead with the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state." The logic is mechanical. Seek God properly. Be pure and upright. Receive restoration. Bildad then appealed to historical precedent. Ask the former generation and find out what their ancestors learned. For we were born only yesterday and know nothing, and our days on earth are but a shadow. Will they not instruct you and tell you? Will they not bring forth words from their understanding? This is the argument from tradition. Our ancestors developed a system for understanding how the world works, and that system says the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer. Don't trust your individual experience, Job. Trust the accumulated wisdom of generations, and that wisdom says you must have done something wrong. Job's response grew sharper. Indeed, I know that this is true, but how can mere mortals prove their innocence? Before God? Here Job acknowledged the power imbalance. Yes, humans are imperfect compared to God. Yes, no one can claim absolute righteousness before the divine. But then he made a disturbing observation. If one wished to dispute with him, they could not answer him 1 time out of 1,000. His wisdom is profound. His power is vast. Who has resisted him and come out unscathed? Job was describing God not as just judge, but as overwhelming force. In a legal dispute with God, the human loses not because they're wrong, but because they're outmatched. God moves mountains, commands the sun, performs wonders. Who can argue with that kind of power? Then Job said something that must have shocked his friends. He destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When a scourge brings sudden death, he mocks the despair of the innocent. When a land falls into the hands of the wicked, he blindfolds its judges. If it is not he, then who is it? This is dangerous territory. Job was suggesting that God's governance might not follow the neat equations his friends believed in. The innocent suffer, the wicked prosper. Job's own experience proved that righteousness doesn't guarantee blessing. And if that's true, then the entire theological framework his friends were defending collapses. Job then articulated his real desire. If only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me, so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him, but as it now stands with me, I cannot. This is the tragedy. Job wanted to make his case, to be heard, to present his defense, but the power differential made dialogue impossible. It's like a trial where the judge, prosecutor, and witness are all the same person, and that person has infinite power. How do you defend yourself in such a system? Zophar the Naamathite spoke third, and his approach was the most direct, the most confrontational. No mystical visions like Eliphaz, no appeals to tradition like Bildad, just blunt accusation. Are all these words to go unanswered? Is this talker to be vindicated? Will your idle talk reduce others to silence? Will no one rebuke you when you mock? You say to God, "My beliefs are flawless, and I am pure in your sight." Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom, for true wisdom has 2 sides. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. Read that last line again. God has even forgotten some of your sin. Zophar wasn't saying Job was innocent. He was saying Job was more guilty than his suffering, indicated that God was actually going easy on him, that he deserved worse than what he was experiencing. Zophar then launched into categorical assertions about divine omniscience. Can you fathom the mysteries of God? Can you probe the limits of the Almighty? They are higher than the heavens above. What can you do? They are deeper than the depths below. What can you know? The argument was meant to humble, to show Job his place, to make him accept that he couldn't understand divine justice and therefore should stop protesting. Submit, confess, repent. That was Zophar's message. And if you do, then you will lift up your face without shame. You will stand firm and without fear. You will surely forget your trouble, recalling it only as waters gone by. All three friends had now spoken. All three employed different rhetorical strategies: mystical authority, traditional wisdom, and direct confrontation. But all three shared the same fundamental position. Job's suffering proved Job's guilt. The system of retribution, justice, righteousness, rewarded, wickedness punished, must be maintained. If Job's experience seemed to contradict this system, then Job's understanding of his own righteousness must be wrong, not the system itself. Job's counter-strategy was complex and costly. He refused to accept their framework. He maintained his innocence, but in doing so, he was forced into an increasingly difficult position, defending himself against God, while maintaining faith in God, protesting divine justice, while not abandoning divine relationship. Doubtless you are the only people who matter, and wisdom will die with you. But I have a mind as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Who does not know all these things? Sarcasm, sharp and bitter. Job was saying, your wisdom isn't profound, it's obvious. Everyone knows the traditional teachings. But the traditional teachings don't account for my experience. They work well as theory, but fail when confronted with reality. Then Job made his own appeal to nature, to the observable world. But ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? Job was, pointing to a complexity in creation that his friend's simple formulas couldn't capture. Nature reveals divine power and wisdom, yes, but it also reveals processes that don't follow human notions of justice. Animals die for no moral reason. Disasters strike without regard to virtue. The world is more complicated than reward and punishment. The first cycle of speech is ended, but this was merely the opening round. Both sides had established their positions. The friends, suffering indicates sin, confess and be restored. Job, I'm innocent. My suffering is unjust. I demand an audience with God. Neither side could win because they were playing different games. The friends wanted to preserve their theological system. Job wanted truth and vindication. What followed would be 2 more cycles of debate, variations on these same themes. The friends would escalate their accusations, growing more certain and more harsh. Job would intensify his protests, growing more desperate and more eloquent. The war of attrition had begun, words against words, theology against experience, the system against suffering. On the ash heap, covered in sores, Job sat surrounded by his accusing comforters. The Satan had tested whether faith survives loss and pain. The Satan's test had been passed. But now, a different trial emerged, one the Satan hadn't anticipated. Whether faith survives theological attack, whether integrity holds when those who claim to speak for God declare that integrity itself is the problem. Job had lost his wealth, his children, his health. Now he was losing something else, the community of belief that should have sustained him. His friends, who should have been his defenders, had become his prosecutors. The isolation wasn't just physical anymore, sitting on the ash heap. It was theological, spiritual, existential. He stood alone in his understanding, abandoned by those who should have stood with him, accused by those who should have advocated for him. The combat continued. The ash heap became a courtroom, a battlefield, a theatre of competing truths, and every word spoken, every argument made, every accusation levelled, drove Job deeper into the impossible position of defending himself against heaven while refusing to abandon heaven, of protesting injustice while maintaining faith, of demanding explanation while acknowledging mystery. The greatest man in the East, reduced to ash and accusations, fought on, not with weapons or wealth, but with words inadequate, desperate, truthful words. The architecture of his righteousness had been tested by loss and pain. Now it was being tested by argument and condemnation, and the test would continue, round after round, until something broke or someone spoke who could break the deadlock. The battle of words had only begun. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from arguments that cannot be won, from positions that cannot be abandoned, from conflicts where both sides are locked into frameworks that make the resolution impossible. The debates on the ash heap entered this territory, a war of attrition, where words became weapons of diminishing effectiveness, where repetition replaced innovation, and where the intensity increased even as the possibility of breakthrough decreased. The second cycle of speeches began. If you had been listening, you would have noticed something. The friends were saying essentially the same things, but with greater urgency, harsher language, more extreme examples. When arguments don't achieve their objective, we tend to amplify them, to speak louder, to become more certain. The friends were experiencing what happens when reality refuses to conform to theory. Instead of questioning the theory, they questioned reality more aggressively. Eliphaz spoke again, and this time the gentleness of his first speech had evaporated. Would a wise person answer with empty notions or fill their belly with the hot east wind? Would they argue with useless words, with speeches that have no value? The accusation was direct. Job, your words are empty, hot air, useless. Then Eliphaz made a more serious charge. But you even undermine piety and hinder devotion to God. Your sin prompts your mouth. You adopt the tongue of the crafty. Now Job wasn't just suffering from hidden sin, he was actively sinning through his speeches, undermining piety itself, speaking craftily. The escalation was clear. Eliphaz continued with descriptions of the wicked man's fate, how he writhes in torment, how darkness terrifies him, how distress and anguish fill him with terror. The implication was transparent. This is your fate, Job, unless you repent. Job's response revealed his growing frustration. I have heard many things like these. You are miserable comforters, all of you. Will your long-winded speeches never end? What ails you that you keep on arguing? Miserable comforters. The phrase captures the tragedy perfectly. They came to comfort and ended up tormenting. Their comfort consisted of accusations. Their sympathy manifested as condemnation. Job then said something profound. I also could speak like you, if you were in my place. I could make fine speeches against you and shake my head at you, but my mouth would encourage you. Comfort from my lips would bring you relief. This is empathy, breaking through anger. Job was saying, I understand your position intellectually. I could argue your side if our situations were reversed, but I wouldn't, because you need comfort, not critique, support, not systems. Your failure isn't intellectual. It's emotional, relational, human. Then Job turned to God with words that mixed faith and accusation in almost unbearable tension. Even now my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. My intercessor is my friend as my eyes pour out tears to God. On behalf of a man, he pleads with God as one pleads for a friend. This is remarkable theology. Job believed that somewhere, somehow, there was a witness to his innocence, an advocate who would speak for him. Even as he accused God of afflicting him unjustly, he appealed to God for vindication. The same God who seemed to be his enemy was also his only hope for justice. This paradox would run through all Job's speeches: simultaneous protest and trust, accusation and appeal. Bildad responded in the second cycle with increased harshness. How long will you hunt for words? Be sensible, and then we can talk. Why are we regarded as cattle and considered stupid in your sight? The friends felt insulted, diminished by Job's refusal to accept their wisdom. Bildad then launched into another description of the wicked person's fate. The lamp of a wicked man is snuffed out. The flame of his fire stops burning. The light in his tent becomes dark. The lamp beside him goes out. He described the wicked man's terror, his trapped condition, his inevitable destruction. Every detail was meant to apply to Job, to show him the trajectory he was on, to frighten him into confession. Bildad ended with, "Surely such is the dwelling of an evil man. Such is the place of one who does not know God." The accusation was now explicit. You don't know God, Job. Your suffering proves your alienation from the divine. Job's anguish deepened. How long will you torment me and crush me with words? 10 times now you have reproached me. Shamelessly you attack me. 10 times. Whether literal or rhetorical, the number conveys relentless, repeated assault. Job felt crushed by words, tormented by theological arguments that should have been sources of comfort. Then he said something that reveals his social reality. He has alienated my family from me. My acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My relatives have gone away. My closest friends have forgotten me. My guests and my female servants count me a foreigner. They look on me as on a stranger. The disease had made him unclean, untouchable. But more than physical isolation, Job was experiencing social death, the dissolution of all relationships, all connections, all community. He had become a stranger to everyone, including his own household. Even children, he said, despised him and mocked him when he appeared. In this pit of abandonment, Job made one of the most famous declarations in ancient literature. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. This is faith beyond circumstances, hope beyond evidence. Job had no reason to believe in future vindication. Everything suggested the opposite. His present was catastrophic. His friends declared his future was divine judgment. But somewhere, in some way, Job believed there would be a Redeemer, someone who would stand up for him, and he would live to see vindication, even if it took resurrection to accomplish it. This declaration represents a strategic trump card in the theological battle. The friends argued from present circumstances, your suffering proves your guilt. Job appealed to future revelation, wait and see, truth will emerge. I will be vindicated eventually, even if not now. He shifted the time frame, moved the goalposts beyond death if necessary. The contest wasn't over when the present ended. Ultimate justice might require ultimate scope eternity itself. Zophar's second speech escalated the harsh rhetoric further. My troubled thoughts prompt me to answer because I am greatly disturbed. I hear a rebuke that dishonors me, and my understanding inspires me to reply. Zophar felt personally attacked by Job's refusal to submit. He took Job's resistance as insult, as dishonor. Then he described the wicked person's joy as brief, the godless person's triumph as momentary. Though his pride reaches to the heavens and his head touches the clouds, he will perish forever, like his own dung. The imagery was deliberately crude, offensive, meant to shock and disgust. Zophar was no longer subtle. He described the wicked swallowing riches and vomiting them up, being sucked dry like a reed. The language of judgment became visceral, physical, revolting. Job's response in this cycle introduced a theme he would develop more fully. Look at the actual world, not at your theories. Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power? They see their children established around them, their offspring before their eyes. Their homes are safe and free from fear. The rod of God is not on them. Job was making an empirical argument. Your system says the wicked suffer and the righteous prosper. But observation shows the opposite. The wicked often thrive, enjoy long life, see their children prosper, die peacefully. Meanwhile, another person dies in bitterness of soul, never having enjoyed anything good. They share the same fate, both lie in the dust, and worms cover them both. This was devastating to the friend's theology. If the wicked prosper and die peacefully, if the righteous suffer and die in bitterness, if both end up in the same dust regardless, then what happened to the system of divine justice? What happened to the moral order that reward follows righteousness and punishment follows wickedness? The third cycle of speeches began, and by now the strain was showing. The friends were running out of new arguments. Their accusations became more extreme, their certainty more brittle, their frustration more evident. Eliphaz, in his third speech, made specific accusations for the first time. Before, he had spoken in generalities about hidden sin. Now he listed particular crimes. Is not your wickedness great? Are not your sins endless? You demanded security from your relatives for no reason. You stripped people of their clothing, leaving them naked. You gave no water to the weary, and you withheld food from the hungry. These were serious charges, exploitation of the vulnerable, abuse of power, failure to practice justice. But notice, Eliphaz had no evidence for these accusations. He was inventing sins to match the punishment, working backward from Job's suffering to deduce what crimes must have caused it. The theology required the sins to exist, so the sins were asserted despite the absence of proof. Eliphaz ended with a formula that had been repeated throughout the debates. Submit to God and be at peace with Him. In this way prosperity will come to you. Accept instruction from His mouth and lay up His words in your heart. If you return to the Almighty, you will be restored. The same offer, over and over. Confess, submit, be restored. The friends couldn't understand why Job wouldn't take this deal. From their perspective, it was simple. Admit wrongdoing, receive healing, move on. Job's refusal seemed like stubborn pride, pointless resistance. But Job couldn't take the deal because the deal required lying. To confess sins he hadn't committed would be to betray truth itself, to validate a false theology, to make his suffering meaningless by attributing it to causes that didn't exist. Job's integrity wouldn't allow him to purchase comfort with falsehood. Job's response in the third cycle revealed his deepest desire. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say to me. Job wanted an audience with God, not with the friends and their systems, but with God directly. He wanted to present his case, hear the response, understand what was happening. The problem wasn't doubt about God's existence or even God's power. It was the absence of explanation, the silence that accompanied the suffering. But if I go to the east, he is not there. If I go to the west, I do not find him. When he is at work in the north, I do not see him. When he turns to the south, catch no glimpse of him. God seemed absent, unreachable, hidden. Job searched but couldn't find him. He called but received no answer. The cosmic silence was perhaps worse than the cosmic affliction. Suffering with explanation can be endured, but suffering without meaning crushes the spirit. Yet even here, Job maintained a remarkable confidence. But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. Testing. Job interpreted his suffering as test, not punishment. This is crucial. Punishment assumes guilt and aims at retribution. Testing assumes value and aims at refinement. Gold is tested to remove impurities, to prove its quality, to increase its worth. Job believed that when the testing ended, his integrity would be validated, his righteousness confirmed. He would emerge refined, not reformed. In chapter 31, Job delivered his final defense, a comprehensive oath of innocence that covered virtually every domain of ethical conduct. If you had been listening to this speech, you would have heard it as a kind of negative confession, a systematic denial of wrongdoing across all categories. If I have walked with falsehood, or my foot has hurried after deceit, if my heart has been led by my eyes, or if my hands have been defiled, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbour's door, if I have denied justice to any of my servants, if I have denied the desires of the poor, or let the eyes of the widow grow weary, if I have seen anyone perishing for lack of clothing, or the needy without garments, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, if I have put my trust in gold or said to pure gold, "You are my security," if I have rejoiced over my enemy's misfortune or gloated over the trouble that came to him. The list went on, covering honesty, sexual purity, justice to servants, care for the poor, treatment of orphans, attitude toward wealth, response to enemies. For each potential sin, Job declared his innocence, and after each declaration he invoked consequences if he was lying. Then may others eat what I have sown, and may my crops be uprooted. Then let my arm fall from the shoulder, let it be broken off at the joint. This was legal language, oath language. Job was essentially saying, I submit to divine judgment. If I'm guilty of these things, let punishment fall. But if I'm innocent, let my innocence be acknowledged. He ended with a powerful statement. Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense, let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. Job wanted formal charges, written accusations, official indictment. If God was prosecuting him, let the charges be stated clearly so he could respond. The absence of specific accusation, combined with the presence of extreme suffering, created an injustice Job couldn't tolerate. He demanded due process, transparency, legal procedure. The text then says, the words of Job are ended. Silence fell on the ash heap. Job had made his final statement, delivered his comprehensive defense, demanded his day in court. The friends had no more arguments. They had repeated their position multiple times with increasing harshness, and Job had refused to yield. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had exhausted their rhetorical ammunition. An impasse had been reached. Neither side could force resolution. The friends couldn't break Job's resistance, couldn't make him confess, couldn't preserve their theological system by getting Job to fit into it. Job couldn't force divine explanation, couldn't get an audience with God, couldn't obtain the vindication he demanded. The war of attrition had ground to a halt, not through victory but through exhaustion. All positions had been stated, all arguments made, all accusations levelled. The friends sat in frustrated silence, Job in defiant silence, and, somewhere in the heavens, the cosmic observers waited to see what would happen next. On the ash heap, surrounded by failed comforters and unanswered questions, Job had maintained his integrity at enormous cost. He had refused to lie to make others comfortable. He had refused to abandon truth to end suffering. He had refused to accept a theological system that made him guilty to preserve its own coherence. But maintaining integrity isn't the same as finding resolution. Standing firm isn't the same as moving forward. Job had won the battle of attrition by not losing, by not yielding, by not breaking. But he hadn't won vindication, understanding, or relief. He had won the right to remain in the impasse, to continue suffering without false confession, to maintain his position without resolution. The greatest man in the East sat on the ash heap, having defeated his friend's arguments without defeating his circumstances, having preserved his integrity without obtaining his vindication. Satan's test had been passed. Job's faith survived loss, pain, and theological assault. But Job's own test continued. His demand for explanation, his cry for justice, his need for God to speak remained unanswered. The silence stretched, the suffering continued, and the question hung in the air. Would God speak? Would heaven respond? Would the cosmic silence finally break? Something new was needed. Someone new was needed to break the deadlock that human wisdom couldn't resolve. There are moments in human affairs when deadlock can only be broken by the introduction of something entirely new, a fresh perspective, an unexpected voice, or a power so overwhelming that it reshapes the very terms of the debate. The ash heap was about to experience both. First came a voice no one had heard before. A young man named Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite, had been present throughout the debates, listening, observing, growing increasingly agitated. The text tells us he had waited to speak because the others were older than he, and in the ancient world, age commanded respect, earned the right to speak first. But now the older men had fallen silent, their arguments exhausted, their positions hardened into immobility. Elihu's anger burned. Notice that anger. Not sadness, not compassion, but anger. And his anger had two targets. He burned against Job for justifying himself rather than God, and he burned against the three friends because they had found no way to refute Job and yet had condemned him. This is fascinating. Elihu was angry at both sides, but for different reasons. Job's error, in Elihu's view, was making himself right at God's expense, defending his innocence so strongly that it implicitly accused the divine of injustice. The friend's error was condemning Job without actually defeating his arguments. They had the right conclusion, but inadequate reasoning. Elihu began his speech with an apology for his youth and an assertion of his right to speak. I am young in 2 years, and you are old. That is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. I thought, age should speak. Advanced years should teach wisdom. But it is the spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty, that gives them understanding. It is not only the old who are wise, not only the aged who understand what is right. He was making a democratic claim about wisdom. It doesn't belong exclusively to the elderly. The Spirit of God can inspire the young as well. This was his authorization to enter the debate despite his youth. Then Elihu did something the three friends had never quite managed. He criticized both Job and his comforters while offering a third way. To Job he said, "You say, 'I am pure, I have done no wrong, I am clean and free from sin. Yet God has found fault with me. He considers me his enemy. He fastens my feet in shackles. He keeps close watch on all my paths.' But I tell you, in this you are not right, for God is greater than any mortal." Elihu wasn't accusing Job of hidden sins like the friends had. Instead, he was saying Job's mistake was demanding that God explain himself, insisting on understanding divine governance, making requirements of the Almighty. "Who are you?" Elihu asked, "to demand that God answer to you?" Elihu then articulated a different understanding of suffering. For God does speak now one way, now another, though no one perceives it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on people as they slumber in their beds, he may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings, to turn them from wrongdoing and keep them from pride, to preserve them from the pit, their lives from perishing by the sword. God speaks, Elihu argued, but through various means, dreams, visions, warnings, and suffering itself might be a form of divine communication, not punishment for past sins, but prevention of future ones, not retribution, but education. Or someone may be chastened on a bed of pain with constant distress in their bones. If there is an angel at their side, a messenger, 1 out of 1,000, sent to tell them how to be upright, and he is gracious to that person and says to God, "Spare them from going down to the pit. I have found a ransom for them," then that person can pray to God and find favor with him. This was a more sophisticated theology than the Friends had offered. Suffering could serve pedagogical purposes, protective purposes, even redemptive purposes. It wasn't simple punishment for specific sins, but could be complex divine communication or intervention. Elihu spoke at length 4 speeches in total, longer than any single speech by the 3 friends. He defended God's justice while acknowledging the mystery of divine governance. He criticized Job's self-justification while not accusing him of the specific sins the friends had invented. He positioned himself as the voice of reason between Job's protest and the friends' condemnation. But here's the important thing to understand. Elihu, despite his passion and his fresh perspective, couldn't break the deadlock either. He added nuance to the theological discussion, but he couldn't answer Job's fundamental demand: to explain my specific suffering. Show me why this happened to me. Let God speak directly to me. Elihu spoke about God, but Job wanted God himself to speak. And then something happened that changed everything. The text says simply, "Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm, out of the storm, out of the whirlwind," not from calm skies or peaceful moments, but from the chaos of wind and power, from the forces that bend trees and scatter dust. The divine voice emerged from nature at its most overwhelming, most uncontrollable, most awesome. Consider for a moment what this means. Job had been demanding an audience with God for chapters, crying out for explanation, insisting on his day in court. The friends had been arguing about God, describing divine justice, defending divine ways. Elihu had been speaking about God's communications through various means, but now God himself spoke, and when he did, he addressed Job directly. Not the friends, not Elihu, but Job, the one who had maintained his integrity, who had refused false confession, who had demanded this very audience. But the nature of God's response was not what anyone expected. "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." Read that carefully. God didn't answer Job's questions. Instead, God questioned Job. The prosecutor became the defendant. The one demanding explanation found himself called to explain. This is strategic reversal of the most profound kind. God didn't defend his governance. He demonstrated that Job lacked the capacity to understand what would need to be explained. Then came the questions. Wave after wave of questions about creation, about nature, about the governance of the cosmos, each one revealing the vast gulf between human understanding and divine knowledge, between human power and divine sovereignty. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me, if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Job wanted to understand his suffering. God asked, "Do you understand creation itself? Were you there when the universe began? Do you know how the foundations were laid? Can you comprehend the cosmic architecture?" The questions continued, relentless. Have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? Can you command the dawn, Job? Can you organize the daily rotation of light and darkness? Do you control the most basic rhythms of existence? Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Do you know the depths of the ocean, the sources of the waters, the boundaries between life and death? Have you explored the full extent of the world you inhabit? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. The irony is profound. Job, you want answers, but can you even frame the right questions? You demand explanation, but do you have the capacity to understand the explanation? You insist on your right to know, but do you comprehend the scope of what you're asking to know? Then God moved to meteorological phenomena. What is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? This is particularly striking. God waters lands where no humans live. Rain falls on uninhabited deserts. The cosmos operates according to purposes beyond human utility, beyond human observation, beyond human benefit. The universe isn't organized around humanity. We're part of a much larger system, and that system has its own logic, its own purposes, its own beauty. Does the rain have a father? Who fathers the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from the heavens? The questions become almost playful, using familial metaphors for natural processes. Who is the parent of rain, the mother of ice? Can you, Job, claim kinship with these forces? Can you trace their genealogy? Then God moved to the stars, to cosmic order. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the Splendide heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? The governance of the stars, the laws that keep celestial bodies in their courses, the vast choreography of the cosmos. Do you control this, Job? Do you even understand it? The universe runs according to principles you can observe but not manage, laws you can notice but not alter. Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, "Here we are"? Do the forces of nature answer to you? When you call, do the lightning bolts respond? Are you sovereign over even the weather, let alone over justice and suffering? Then God turned to the animal kingdom, describing creatures in vivid detail, asking Job about his relationship to them and his understanding of their natures. Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket? Who provides food for the raven? When its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food, God feeds the predators. God provides for the ravens. The natural world continues through divine provision that operates independently of human agency. Lions hunt, ravens scavenge, young birds cry out, and somehow the system works. Do you manage this, Job? Do you feed the wildlife? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Do you count the months till they bear? Do you know the time they give birth? The intimate details of animal reproduction, the timing of births, the cycles of wilderness creatures, are you involved in this, Job? Do you oversee the propagation of species in remote mountains? God described the wild donkey. Who let the wild donkey go free? Who untied its ropes? I gave it the wasteland as its home, the salt flats as its habitat. It laughs at the commotion in the town. It does not hear a driver's shout. Here is freedom, built into creation, animals that resist domestication, that thrive in wastelands, that laugh at human attempts to control them. The wild donkey represents a part of creation that simply doesn't fit into human systems, doesn't serve human purposes. exists for its own sake or God's pleasure? Then the wild ox. Will the wild ox consent to serve you? Will it stay by your manger at night? Can you hold it to the furrow with a harness? Will it till the valleys behind you? Power that refuses to be harnessed, strength that won't submit to human direction. The wild ox possesses massive force but won't work for humans. Can you change this, Job? Can you domesticate the untamable? God described the ostrich in almost comical terms. The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare with the wings and feathers of the stork. She lays her eggs on the ground and lets them warm in the sand, unmindful that a foot may crush them, that some wild animal may trample them. She treats her young harshly, as if they were not hers. She cares not that her labour was in vain, for God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. Yet when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at horse and rider. This is fascinating. God created a creature that seems foolish, that doesn't protect its eggs properly, that treats its young harshly. Not everything in creation follows principles of optimal design for survival. There's room for the absurd, the inefficient, the strange. And yet the ostrich runs magnificently, laughing at horses. Beauty and foolishness coexist in creation by divine design. Then God turned to the horse, describing its strength and courage in battle. Do you give the horse its strength or clothe its neck with a flowing mane? Do you make it leap like a locust, striking terror with its proud snorting? It paws fiercely, rejoicing in its strength, and charges into the fray. It laughs at fear, afraid of nothing. It does not shy away from the sword. The war horse represents courage, power, eagerness for battle, qualities that inspire awe. Can you instill these qualities, Job? Can you create courage where it doesn't exist? Finally, God described the birds of prey. Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle soar at your command and build its nest on high? It dwells on a cliff and stays there at night. A rocky crag is its stronghold. From there it looks for food. Its eyes detect it from afar. The eagle's vision, its ability to see prey from vast distances, its choice of inaccessible nesting sites, this is wild, sovereignty, predatory excellence beyond human instruction. Then God asked, "Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him." The divine speech paused. The question hung in the air. Job had wanted to contend with God, to present his case, to demand answers. Now he was invited to respond. But respond to what? God hadn't explained Job's suffering. God had demonstrated cosmic complexity, creative diversity, natural mystery. The strategy was not explanation, but perspective shift. Look at what you don't know, Job, before you demand to know what you think you deserve to understand. Job's response was brief, almost shocking in its brevity after all his speeches. "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer twice, but I will say no more." This wasn't confession of moral guilt. This was acknowledgement of intellectual presumption. Job didn't say, "I sinned," as my friends claimed. He said, "I spoke without adequate understanding." He had demanded explanation of divine governance while lacking comprehension of even natural governance. He had insisted on his right to understand, while demonstrating he didn't understand the foundations of the world he inhabited. But God wasn't finished. The whirlwind spoke again, and what followed would force Job to an even deeper recognition of the gulf between human and divine perspective, between demanding answers and deserving them, between protest and acceptance. The voice from the whirlwind had shattered the theological stalemate, not by answering the questions, but by reframing them, not by defending divine justice, but by revealing divine mystery, not by explaining suffering, but by demonstrating that explanation, even if given, would exceed human capacity to comprehend. On the ash heap, covered in sores, surrounded by silent friends and a young man's speeches, Job had finally received his audience with God. But the audience wasn't what he expected, and its effect would be something he couldn't have anticipated. The cosmic conversation continued. There is a kind of silence that follows revelation, a pause where the old understanding has been shattered but the new one hasn't yet fully formed. Job sat in that silence, his hand over his mouth, having acknowledged that he had spoken beyond his knowledge. But the whirlwind, that wasn't finished. God spoke again, and this time the questions became even more direct, more challenging. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? This was the heart of the matter. Job's protest, however honest, however justified by his own innocence, had implied that God's governance was flawed. To maintain his righteousness, Job had been forced to question divine justice. To defend himself, he had been compelled to accuse heaven. God was making explicit what had been implicit all along. You can't assert your absolute innocence without suggesting my absolute failure. Then came two final creatures, described in extraordinary detail, Behemoth and Leviathan. These weren't ordinary animals from the catalogue of creation. These were primordial powers, forces of chaos barely contained, representing something beyond domestication, beyond human control, beyond understanding. Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscles of its belly. Its tail sways like a cedar, the sinews of its thighs are close-knit, its bones are tubes of bronze, its limbs like rods of iron. It ranks first among the works of God, yet its maker can approach it with his sword. Behemoth, perhaps elephant, perhaps hippopotamus, perhaps something beyond identification, a creature of such power that only God can approach it with a sword. And Leviathan, described with even more terrifying majesty. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. These creatures represented forces in creation that humans cannot master, cannot control, cannot even approach safely. They exist as testimony to divine power, as reminders of human limitation. If you can't manage these creatures I made, God was saying, how can you presume to judge how I manage the moral universe? Job's final response came not as argument, but as surrender. Not surrender of integrity, but surrender of presumption. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Things too wonderful for me to know. This is the phrase that captures everything. Job wasn't recanting his innocence. He wasn't confessing the sins his friends had accused him of. He was acknowledging mystery that divine governance operates at scales and according to purposes that exceed human comprehension, that the questions he asked assumed a simplicity that doesn't exist, that his demand for explanation presumed a capacity for understanding he didn't possess. Then Job said something that reveals the transformation. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself, and repent in dust and ashes. This is profound. Job had known about God through tradition, through teaching, through religious practice, but now he had encountered God directly, experienced the divine presence, and been addressed by the whirlwind. The difference between knowing about and knowing directly changed everything. Not because Job learned new information, but because he experienced new reality. The repentance wasn't for moral failing, but for intellectual overreach. He despised himself not for being wicked, but for being presumptuous. He repented in dust and ashes, appropriate symbols for acknowledging human limitation, mortality, creatureliness. The cosmic test was complete. Job had maintained his integrity through loss, through pain, through accusation, through silence, and finally through divine questioning. His faith survived not just adversity but mystery, not just suffering but the absence of explanation. The Satan's hypothesis that righteousness is always strategic, always conditional, always self-serving, had been disproven conclusively. But then God did something unexpected. He turned to Eliphaz, the spokesman for the three friends, and said, "I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." Let that sink in. Job, who had protested divine justice, who had demanded explanations, who had questioned divine governance, he spoke rightly. The friends, who had defended God, who had explained suffering as punishment, who had maintained orthodox theology, they spoke wrongly. Why? Because Job spoke honestly from his experience and maintained truth even when it was costly. The friends spoke falsely to defend their system, invented sins to preserve their theology, chose systematic coherence over honest observation. Job's protest was more acceptable than the friends' defense because Job's protest was true and the friends' defense was false. God commanded the friends to make sacrifices and have Job pray for them. Job, the accused, became the intercessor. Job, the one they had condemned, became their advocate. This reversal restored Job's position as righteous mediator, vindicated his integrity publicly, gave him back the moral authority his suffering had seemed to undermine. And Job prayed for his friends. Despite everything they had said, all the accusations they had leveled, all the pain they had added to his suffering, he prayed for them. This demonstrates something remarkable about Job's character. He could be vindicated without being vindictive, proven right without becoming self-righteous, restored without seeking revenge. The text says, "After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before." Twice as much. The restoration wasn't merely to the previous level, it exceeded it. Job had owned 7,000 sheep before. Now he owned 14,000. 3,000 camels became 6,500. The yoke of oxen became 1,000. 500 female donkeys became 1,000. His brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him came to his house. Think about that these were the people who had stayed away during his affliction, who had avoided him in his uncleanness, who had let him sit alone on the ash heap. Now they returned, bringing gifts, eating with him, comforting him, for all the trouble the Lord had brought on him. Even they acknowledged the source of his suffering. This wasn't random disaster, wasn't punishment for sin, but trouble the Lord had brought. The text makes this explicit, validating Job's experience while offering no explanation for why it happened. Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters again. The daughters' names are given Jemimah, Keziah, and Keren-Happuch, and the text notes they were the most beautiful women in all the land. More remarkably, Job gave them inheritance along with their brothers, unusual in ancient culture, perhaps reflecting a father who had lost daughters once and valued them beyond convention. Job lived 140 years after this, long enough to see 4 generations of descendants. He saw his children and their children and their children's children. The text says he died old and full of years. This is complete restoration not just of possessions, but of family, of community, of years, of joy. The architecture that had been demolished was rebuilt, not identical to what was before, but transformed by what had happened. The story of Job ends, but its questions echo. Why do the righteous suffer? The book doesn't answer, not directly. What it shows instead is that faith can survive without answers, that integrity can endure mystery, that relationship with God doesn't depend on understanding God's purposes. Job proved something about human nature that the Satan doubted, that genuine devotion exists, that love without calculation is possible, that someone can fear God for nothing, expecting nothing, demanding nothing, yet maintaining everything essential. The greatest man in the East had his greatness tested to destruction and rebuilt through that destruction. He learned that the universe is more complex than human ethics can capture, that divine governance operates at scales beyond human judgment, that demanding explanations assumes capacities for comprehension we don't possess. But he also learned something else, that honest protest is better than false piety, that maintaining truth matters more than defending systems, that God can handle our questions even when we can't handle God's answers. On the ash heap, Job had been stripped of everything. In restoration, he received everything back and more. But what he carried forward wasn't just restored prosperity, it was transformed understanding. He had heard of God. Now he had seen God. He had known about divine power. Now he had encountered it directly. He had believed in justice. Now he accepted mystery. The architecture of righteousness still stood, but it rested on deeper foundations, not the transactional equations of reward and punishment, but the recognition that relationship with the divine transcends circumstances, survives incomprehension, endures beyond explanation. Job's story becomes our story whenever we face suffering we don't deserve, loss we can't explain, pain that seems to contradict everything we believe about how the world should work. The book doesn't promise answers. It promises something else, that integrity can be maintained in the absence of understanding, that faith can survive the loss of certainty, that we can trust even what we cannot comprehend. The whirlwind spoke. Job listened. The cosmos revealed its complexity. Job acknowledged his limits. The test was passed. The integrity held. The architecture stood, rebuilt on foundations of mystery rather than certainty, on encounter rather than explanation, on relationship rather than transaction, and in the end, that proved to be enough, more than enough. It proved to be everything.